The weight of Lyra's steps echoed through the polished corridors of Ethelgard, each footfall a reminder of her existence in a world not built for her. At 7 feet tall, with broad shoulders and a frame that seemed carved from the ancient mountainsides rather than the delicate, willowy bodies of typical Ethelgardians, she was impossible to miss, yet paradoxically invisible. The vaulted ceilings that most found grandiose and uplifting were merely adequate to her scale. The doorways that others passed through without thought required her to duck her head in submission. Today, like every day, she made herself smaller. Shoulders hunched, steps measured to minimize the sound, eyes downcast to avoid the flicking glances of disgust, curiosity, or worst of all, pity. She had learned early that to be seen was to be scrutinized, and to be scrutinized was to be found wanting. Anomaly. The medical council had labeled her when she reached maturity. Biologically incompatible. They had declared without emotion as they reviewed her genetic and physical assessments. The reproduction division's chief geneticist, a thin woman with fingers like bird bones, had tapped a screen displaying Lyra's body scan and sighed with practiced sympathy. Your reproductive system cannot be calibrated to our genetic standards. Your pelvic structure, uterine dimensions, and hormonal patterns are excessive, unpredictable. Your body is simply too large to be reliably integrated into our breeding protocols. What the geneticist didn't say, but what everyone in Ethelgard understood, was that Lyra's body was a biological error, a throwback to an earlier, cruder time when humans had needed strength rather than refinement. In the carefully engineered society of Ethelgard, where each citizen was designed for optimal efficiency, aesthetic harmony, and reproductive predictability, Lyra was not merely different. She was useless. No reproduction meant no contribution to the genetic refinement of the population. And in Ethelgard, contribution was citizenship. She made her way through Central Hub, the transit center where most Ethelgardians moved efficiently between their educational, professional, and residential sectors. Her work classification, manual environmental maintenance, was a polite term for the physical labor that most citizens consider beneath them. She maintained the green belts that provided oxygen and aesthetic relief within the city's crystalline architecture. It was work that utilized her strength, while keeping her mostly out of sight in the carefully tended forests and gardens that most citizens merely viewed through windows. Her small living unit waited in the outer ring, far from the gleaming spires of the inner districts. While technically part of the city, the outer ring housed those few who served but did not fully belong. The genetic anomalies, the functionally limited, the socially incompatible. They were not outcasts. Ethelgard was too civilized for such primitive concepts, but they were separate, contained, managed. Lyra stepped off the transit platform. Her work uniform's hood still pulled up despite the mild weather. It was her last shield against the stairs. 3 more blocks, and she could retreat into her small sanctuary, a unit designed for someone of average height, which she had gradually modified to accommodate her frame. Furniture removed to make space. A mattress on the floor rather than the standard floating bed. Counter surfaces raised with blocks. She was halfway home when she heard the commotion. A small crowd of young Ethelgardians, student from the look of their sleek uniforms, had gathered in a semicircle at the edge of a small decorative garden. Their perfect postures and identical heights made them look less like individuals and more like a carefully arranged art installation. But their attention was focused downward, and their whispers carried notes of amusement and disdain. Lyra should have continued walking. Nothing good ever came from inserting herself into the affairs of true citizens. But something about the quality of their laughter made her pause, and before she could reconsider, she found herself approaching. They were clustered around a man kneeling in the soil, attempting to gather various tools that had spilled from a work case. He wore the simple gray garment of a maintenance worker, but even kneeling, Lyra could see he didn't fit the Ethelgardian mold. His shoulders were too wide, his hands too large, his skin sun-darkened rather than possessing the uniform paleness of those who live their lives indoors. Most tellingly, his movements lacked the precise, measured quality of Ethelgardian gestures. "Look how he fumbles," One student whispered, not bothering to lower her voice. Like he's used to having fingers. Outsiders shouldn't be permitted in the educational sector. Another said with clinical disapproval. It disrupts the aesthetic harmony. I heard they're bringing more of them in for the expansion projects, a third added. Apparently some tasks are still more efficiently performed by manual labor. The hesitation before the final words made them sound like a disease. The kneeling man continued gathering his tools, his movements becoming more tense, but his face carefully blank. He reached for a specialized calibrator, but one of the students casually shifted position, placing his foot directly on the device. "Oh," the student said without inflection, "I didn't see that there." Lyra's body moved before her mind could caution restraint. In 3 long strides, she was at the edge of the group. Her shadow fell across them, sudden as an eclipse. The students turned, expressions transitioning from surprise to wariness as they took in her size. She said nothing but slowly extended her hand toward the ground, palm up. The message was unmistakable. "Remove your foot." After a moment's calculation, measuring her size against his status, perhaps, the student stepped back. Lyra knelt, picked up the delicate calibrator, and without looking at the students, handed it to the kneeling man. For the first time, he looked up. His eyes were dark against weathered skin, and they widened slightly as they traveled up to take in her full height. But unlike the students, unlike almost everyone she encountered, his gaze held no judgment, no fear, no pity. He simply saw her. "Thank you," he said, taking the calibrator. His voice was deeper than the light, modulated tones of Ethelgardians. It rumbled like distant thunder. The students, interest lost now that their entertainment had been interrupted, drifted away with the synchronized grace that came from lifelong movement training. Lyra became aware that she was still kneeling, still looking at the man who was now carefully examining the calibrator for damage. "They didn't break it," he said, seeming to sense her concern. "Good thing. These aren't easy to replace." He looked up again, and this time there was the faintest suggestion of a smile at the corners of his eyes. "I'm Kale." His name was offered simply, without the identifier codes that Ethelgardians always attach to introductions: sector, function, genetic line. "Lyra," she responded, her own voice sounding strangely rough to her ears. How long had it been since she'd spoken to someone who wasn't issuing instructions or requests? "You work the green belts," he said, not a question. He gestured to the soil traces on her uniform. She nodded, suddenly awkward, aware of how they must look kneeling in the garden like oversized children. "Northwestern Sector. Zone 12. I'm assigned to maintenance. Systems infrastructure." He closed his case, its contents now recovered. "Just transferred from the Eastern Hub." Lyra didn't know how to continue the conversation. Social scripts had never been her strength, and years of isolation had left her conversational skills withered. She rose to her full height, automatically hunching her shoulders out of habit. Kale stood as well. He was shorter than her by at least a head, but still notably taller than the Ethelgardian average. Like her, his body showed the signs of physical labor: calloused hands, defined muscles, posture shaped by effort rather than aesthetics training. "Zone 12, he repeated thoughtfully. "The old atmospheric processors are there. They're on my repair schedule for next week." Lyra found herself nodding again. The eastern boundary, by the tall silver towers. "Maybe I'll see you," he said, and there was no expectation in his voice, no hidden meaning. Just a simple observation. "Maybe," she echoed, and with a small, awkward nod, she turned and continued her journey home, feeling strangely lighter than she had moments before. It was 3 days later when their paths crossed again. Lyra was pruning the high branches of specially engineered oxygen-producing trees, a task made easier by her height, but still requiring the use of an extension ladder for the tallest sections. She was balanced near the top when she heard the approach of a maintenance vehicle, a quiet hum that nonetheless stood out in the peaceful green belt. The vehicle stopped, and she glanced down to see Kale emerging, tool case in hand. He spotted her immediately and raised a hand in greeting. She managed a small nod, conscious of her precarious position on the ladder. The atmosphere processor, she called down, surprising herself with the initiative. He nodded, squinting up at her against the filtered sunlight that streamed through the canopy. Annual calibration. It's overdue. Lyra finished her cut, secured her pruning tool, and began her descent. By the time she reached the ground, Kale had already opened an access panel on the processor, a cylindrical structure about 12 feet tall that hummed quietly as it converted carbon dioxide to oxygen and regulated moisture levels in the greenbelt. These old models are more reliable than the new ones, he commented as she approached. Less efficient, but fewer breakdowns. Lyra had never considered the processors beyond knowing they were essential for maintaining the microclimate of the greenbelt. How do they work? She asked, then immediately felt foolish. Ethel Guardians didn't ask how things worked. They simply performed their assigned functions. But Kale didn't seem to find the question strange. As his hands moved among the components, adjusting, testing, calibrating, he explained the underlying principles. His explanation was clear, detailed, but not condescending, and Lyra found herself drawn into the conversation. "Would you hand me the resonance tester?" he asked after a while, gesturing to his open case. She did, and somehow, that simple exchange became the pattern of the afternoon. Kale worked, explained, asked for assistance. Lyra helped, questioned, learned. The minutes stretched into hours, and neither seemed to notice the passage of time. "Your trees look healthy," he commented as he finally closed the access panel. "The oxygen readings are higher than anywhere else in the sector." "They respond well to voice," Lyra said, then felt heat rise to her face. It was an admission that she talked to the trees, something that would be considered irrational and primitive by Ethelgardian standards. But Kale simply nodded. "Living things do," he agreed, and there was something in his eyes, understanding, perhaps, or shared knowledge, that made Lyra feel seen in a way she rarely experienced. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows through the green belt. Lyra realized with a start that she had spent hours in conversation with Kale, more sustained human interaction than she'd had in years. "I should go," she said, suddenly awkward again. "My shift ended an hour ago." Kale closed his tool case. "Mine too," he said with a small smile. But this was more interesting. Lyra didn't know how to respond to that. In Ethelgard, work was performed for the collective good, not for interest or satisfaction. "Do you live far?" Kale asked as they walked toward the edge of the green belt, where both had left their respective equipment. "Outer Ring. Section 8, she replied. His eyebrows rose slightly. "I'm in Section 10. We're practically neighbors." The transit system that would take them back to the Outer Ring was running on reduced evening schedule. They found themselves waiting together on the platform, standing slightly apart from the few Ethelgardians also traveling outward at this hour. "Where are you from?" Lyra finally asked, her curiosity overcoming her habitual reserve. "Originally, the coastal settlements," Kale replied. "My people have been there for generations. But resources are dwindling, and Ethelgard needs manual laborers." His tone was matter-of-fact, without bitterness. "You? I was born here," Lyra said, "but my genetic line was miscalculated. My parents were both within standard parameters, but She gestured vaguely at her height. "Genetic expression is complex," Kale said with a small shrug. "In the settlements, variety is expected, valued even." The statement was so contrary to everything Ethelgardian that Lyra couldn't immediately process it. Before she could respond, the transit arrived, its doors sliding open silently. They found seats together, conspicuous among the smaller, uniformly proportioned Ethelgardians. Lyra was acutely aware of the sideways glances, the subtle shifts away. But sitting beside Kale, she felt less exposed, less singular in her difference. "Why did you help me?" Kale asked suddenly. "With the students." Lyra considered the question. "They were being cruel," she finally said. "And I know what that feels like." Kale nodded slowly. "In the settlements, we have a saying, 'The ones who know winter's bite never withhold fire.'" Again, before Lyra could fully process his words, the transit announced Section 8. Her stop. "This is me," she said, rising. I'll see you in the Greenbelt, Kale asked, and there was something like hope in his voice. Lyra nodded, surprised to realize she was looking forward to it. I'm there every day. As the transit doors closed behind her and she made her way to her small unit, Lyra replayed the day in her mind. For the first time in longer than she could remember, she had been engaged in conversation as an equal. No averted eyes, no clinical assessment, no carefully masked disdain. Just two people talking. It shouldn't have felt revolutionary, but it did. The following weeks established a pattern. Kale's work regularly brought him to the Greenbelt, and even when his official duties didn't require it, he found reasons to visit Zone 12. Lyra began looking forward to these encounters, planning her work routes to maximize the chance of crossing paths. Their conversations expanded beyond work. Kale told her of the coastal settlements, communities that maintained older ways of living, more connected to the natural world, more accepting of human variation. Lyra shared her limited experiences of Ethelgard, the beauty of its design, the efficiency of its systems, the cold isolation of its perfection. They value what is measurable, she explained one afternoon as they sat beneath the shade of a massive oxygen tree during their meal break. Efficiency, predictability, optimization, and they can't measure the worth of difference, Kale mused. The value of adaptation, of unexpected strengths. Like what? Lyra challenged, more from curiosity than disagreement. Kale gestured to her. Your height lets you reach what others can't. Your strength accomplishes what would take 3 of them. Your body isn't wrong, it's specialized. The concept was so foreign to everything Lyra had been taught that she couldn't immediately respond. Her body had always been a liability, a failure, a barrier to full citizenship. The idea that it might be an asset, a specialization rather than a flaw, was simultaneously liberating and terrifying. What about you? She asked instead of pursuing that uncomfortable line of thought. What's your specialization? Kale smiled, a quick flash of unexpected warmth in his weathered face. Understand systems, how parts work together, how one change affects everything else. In the settlements, that made me valuable. Here, it makes me useful enough to tolerate. As the days passed, their meal breaks grew longer, their conversations deeper, their silences more comfortable. They discovered shared interests in the natural patterns of growth, in the way living systems adapted to challenges. They found common ground in their status as outsiders and in their commitment to excellence in their work despite the lack of recognition. They found, in short, a connection that neither had expected. It was nearly a month after their first meeting when Kale failed to appear at their usual meeting spot. Lyra told herself it was ridiculous to worry. He had other work assignments, other sectors to maintain. He wasn't obligated to visit the Greenbelt every day. But by the 3rd day of his absence, concern had settled in her chest like a physical weight. She found herself distracted, her usually meticulous work suffering from uncharacteristic errors. She considered asking the sector supervisor about maintenance schedules, but dismissed the idea immediately. Drawing attention to their friendship could only lead to scrutiny neither of them needed. On the 4th day, she saw him approaching across the Greenbelt, and the release of tension was so powerful she had to steady herself against a tree. But as he drew closer, she could see he was moving with careful deliberation, one arm held protectively against his side. What happened? She asked as soon as he was close enough to hear. Minor accident, Kale said with a dismissive shrug that couldn't quite hide a wince. Service tunnel collapse in Sector 4. I was trapped for a few hours. Hours? Lyra echoed, appalled. Why didn't they get you out immediately? Kale's face took on the careful neutrality she recognized as a shield against Ethelgardian indifference. The tunnel wasn't critical infrastructure, and there were no citizens in danger. Just you, Lyra thought with a surge of anger she hadn't expected. Just an outsider whose life was valued less than maintenance schedules. Let me see, she said, her voice more commanding than she'd intended. For a moment, she thought he would refuse. Then, with a slight nod, he lifted the edge of his work tunic to reveal his side. A massive bruise spread across his ribs, the colors shifting from angry red at the center to purple and then sickly yellow at the edges. Lyra inhaled sharply. Have you had medical treatment? Basic medical unit patched me up. Nothing's broken. His tone suggested this was sufficient, but Lyra found herself unwilling to accept such minimal care. I have regenerative gel in my unit, she said decisively, for when I cut myself pruning. It works better than anything they dispense at the medical units. Kale raised an eyebrow. Settlement medicine? Lyra nodded. I trade extra oxygen fruit for it, with one of the market vendors who brings in outside goods. The small black market that operated in the shadows of Ethelgard's perfect economy was something neither of them had openly acknowledged before. It existed in the spaces between official supply chains, catering to those whose needs deviated from the standardized provisions. I'd appreciate that, Kale said simply. It wasn't until they were on the transit heading towards Section 8 that Lyra realized she had invited him to her living unit, her private space that no one had entered since she had taken occupancy years ago. The realization should have filled her with anxiety, but instead, she found herself mentally reorganizing her space to accommodate a visitor. Her unit was small, but meticulously organized. Everything had its place, necessary when space was at a premium. Kale entered with a respectful slowness, his eyes taking in the modifications she had made to accommodate her size. The raised counters, the low furniture, the sleeping mat on the floor instead of standard bed. It's practical, he commented, and there was approval in his voice rather than pity. It's home, she replied, and was surprised to realize she meant it. This space, adapted to her needs, was perhaps the only place in Ethelgard where she didn't feel wrong. She retrieved the regenerative gel from her small medical cabinet. It was a thick, slightly iridescent substance that smelled faintly of herbs and minerals. You'll need to sit, she said, gesturing to her reinforced chair, the only proper seat in the unit. Kale sat and once again lifted his tunic to expose the injury. In the clear lighting of her unit, the bruising looked even worse than it had in the filtered sunlight of the green belt. Lyra knelt beside the chair, suddenly acutely aware of their physical proximity. She had never touched another person with intent before. Only accidental brushes in crowded transit cars or necessary contact during work tasks. Now she found herself hesitating, the gel in her hand, uncertain how to proceed. It's all right, Kale said softly. I trust you. 3 simple words that somehow contain volumes. I trust you, not just with this injury, but with vulnerability, with closeness, with care. Slowly, carefully, Lyra began to apply the gel to the bruised area. Her large hands, usually a source of self-consciousness, worked with unexpected gentleness. The gel warmed upon contact with skin, and she could feel the slight relaxation of his muscles as the pain-relieving properties took effect. The settlements have better medicine in some ways, Kale said, his voice slightly rougher than usual. Natural compounds that Ethelgard has forgotten or dismissed. They focus so much on genetic prevention of illness that they've neglected the art of healing. Does it help? Lyra asked, focused on ensuring every part of the bruise was covered with a thin layer of gel. Yes, Kale said, and there was something in his tone that made her look up. Their eyes met, and in that moment, something shifted between them. A boundary crossed. A distance closed. Kale's hand moved, slowly enough that she could have withdrawn, and came to rest gently against her cheek. His palm was warm, slightly callous from his work, and achingly gentle. Thank you, he said, and those 2 words seemed to carry as much weight as his earlier declaration of trust. Lyra found herself unable to respond verbally. Instead, instinctively, she leaned slightly into his touch. It was such a small movement, barely perceptible, but Kale's eyes widened slightly in recognition. The moment stretched, delicate as spider silk, neither willing to break it. Then, with equal care, Kale leaned forward, slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away. She didn't. Their first kiss was gentle, tentative, a question asked and answered in the press of lips. When they separated, Lyra found herself trembling slightly, overwhelmed by sensation and meaning. I wanted to do that since you scared those students away, Kale admitted with a small smile. You were magnificent, towering and fierce, and absolutely perfect. Perfect. The word hit her like a physical shock. No one had ever used that word for her before. In Ethelgard, perfection was measured in conformity, in fitting precisely into predetermined parameters. It was the antithesis of everything she was. Yet here was Kale, looking at her with absolute sincerity, using that very word. I'm not, she said, the automatic denial rising to her lips. You are, he countered, his hand still warm against her cheek. Not by their standards, by the standards that matter, which are courage, kindness, strength used to protect, intelligence applied with compassion. His thumb traced a gentle arc along her cheekbone. The standards that see value in difference, that understand perfection isn't uniformity, but adaptation. Lyra closed her eyes, letting his words sink into places within her that had been barren for so long. When she opened them again, she saw nothing but acceptance in his gaze. Stay, she said simply. Not a command, an invitation. Yes, he answered, equally simple. That night changed everything. In the small confines of her adapted living unit, they discovered each other with wonder and care. Their bodies, both outsized by Ethelgardian standards, but perfectly matched to each other, moved together with a harmony that felt like coming home. Where Lyra had always felt too large, too strong, too much, with Kale she felt right. Proportionate, balanced. In the quiet aftermath, lying together on her sleep mat that somehow accommodated them both, Kale traced patterns on her skin with gentle fingers. In the settlements, he said softly, your body would be celebrated. Powerful women are considered blessed, likely to bear strong children, to survive difficult circumstances, to lead with resilience. Lyra stiffened slightly at the mention of children. She had long ago sealed away any thoughts of motherhood, any dreams of family beyond herself. The medical council's verdict had been absolute. Her body was incompatible with Ethelgard's reproductive technologies and protocols. Kale sensed her withdrawal. I've said something wrong, he observed. Not wrong, Lyra said after a moment. Just impossible. I can't have children. My body is too abnormal. The medical council certified it years ago. Kale was silent for a long moment, his hand now resting warm and steady against her hip. The medical council, he finally said, his voice carefully neutral, might have a limited understanding of human biology outside their engineered parameters. Lyra appreciated his attempt at comfort, but knew better than to indulge in false hope. They're very thorough, she said. Very scientific. If there was any chance, they would have enrolled me in the reproduction program. Every citizen is valuable for genetic contribution. Every citizen who fits their definition, Kale countered, a rare edge entering his voice. But human reproduction existed long before their technologies, before their parameters. Lyra didn't know how to respond to that. The possibility was too painful to contemplate, too dangerous to hope for. She changed the subject, and Kale allowed it. But she caught him watching her, sometimes with a thoughtful expression that suggested the conversation wasn't truly closed. The weeks that followed were the happiest of Lyra's life. Their work schedules aligned more often than not, allowing them to spend their days working in companionable proximity and their evenings together in her unit or occasionally in his, which was similarly modified to accommodate his above-average height. They traded stories, shared meals prepared from their combined rations, and gradually built a life together in the margins of Ethelgardian society. It was a life lived carefully, their relationship kept discreet. Not because such connections were forbidden. Ethelgard had no explicit prohibition against emotional or physical partnerships outside the reproduction program, but because drawing attention was never safe for those who already existed at the edges of acceptance. So they were careful, professional in public, reserved on transit, affectionate only behind closed doors. But happiness, Lyra discovered, was difficult to hide completely. She found herself standing straighter, her habitual hunch giving way to her natural height. She spoke more in work meetings, her voice stronger, her ideas clearer. She even found herself smiling at strangers occasionally, small, tentative offerings of connection that would have been unthinkable months before. Cale flourished as well. His natural talents for system integration led to several innovations in the atmosphere processors that increased efficiency by measurable percentages. When word reached the engineering division, he was temporarily assigned to a special project team, still as manual labor, but with greater responsibility and visibility. "They're starting to see your value," Lyra told him proudly one evening as they celebrated his new assignment with a rare treat. Real coffee, traded from an outer sector vendor. "They're starting to see my utility," Cale corrected gently. "It's not the same, but it's a start." It was around this time that Lyra began experiencing subtle changes in her body. At first, she attributed the occasional dizziness and unusual fatigue to the changing seasons, the adjustment of the atmosphere processors to autumn settings. The mild nausea in the mornings she blamed on a new nutritional supplement being added to the standard ration bars. But when her work uniform, specially made for her non-standard measurements, began to feel snug around the middle, she could no longer ignore the mounting evidence that something was changing. "I might need to visit the medical unit," she told Cale one evening, trying to keep her voice casual. "I've been feeling off." His dark eyes studied her with the penetrating insight she had come to both love and find slightly unnerving. "Off how?" She described her symptoms haltingly, embarrassed by the weakness they represented. Cale listened without interruption, but she could see his expression changing as she spoke, transforming from concern to something more complex. Speculation, calculation, a growing suspicion. "Lyra," he said carefully when she had finished, "have you considered that these might be symptoms of pregnancy?" She stared at him, speechless for a moment before an uncomfortable laugh escaped her. "That's impossible. I told you. You told me what the medical council told you," Cale interrupted gently, "that you were incompatible with their reproduction program. But we haven't been using their program. We've been." He gestured between them, a small smile touching his lips. "Traditional." Lyra shook her head, unwilling to even consider the possibility. Hope was too dangerous. Disappointment too certain. The medical council has the most advanced biological knowledge in the world. If they say it's impossible, they said it was impossible within their parameters, Cale insisted. Their technology, their protocols, not impossible altogether. Lyra felt dizzy suddenly, and not from her mysterious condition. The idea that Cale had proposed was simultaneously terrifying and exhilarating. If he was right, but he couldn't be. The medical council had been absolutely clear. Her body was wrong. Incompatible. Too large, too different, too much. "Let's just go to the medical unit," she said finally. "They'll figure out what's actually wrong." The nearest medical facility was in Sector 7, a sleek building of glass and polished metal that Lyra had always avoided when possible. Medical assessments were never pleasant experiences for those who deviated from norms. She registered at the automated kiosk, which scanned her identity chip, recorded her biometrics, and assigned her to examination room 12. Cale wasn't permitted beyond the waiting area. He wasn't experiencing symptoms, and Ethelgard's medical protocols were strict about resource allocation. The examination room was impersonal, clinically white, with a diagnostic bed designed for standard-sized patients. Lyra perched uncomfortably on its edge, feeling as she always did in Ethelgardian spaces. Too large, too intrusive, too much. The door slid open to admit a medical practitioner, a tall, thin woman with a perfect posture and neutral expression typical of her profession. She consulted a data tablet, then looked up at Lyra with the carefully calibrated eye contact that passed for personal attention in Ethelgardian medical practice. "Anomaly 7729L, she said, using Lyra's official designation rather than her name. "You're reporting unexplained symptoms?" Lyra described her condition as factually as possible. The medical practitioner listened without expression, occasionally entering notes on her tablet. "A full diagnostic scan is indicated," she concluded. "Please recline on the examination bed." Lyra complied, uncomfortable as always with the bed's dimensions. The practitioner activated the diagnostic array, a semicircular apparatus that extended over the bed, emitting a soft blue light as it scanned her body from head to toe. The scan took less than a minute. When it was complete, the practitioner studied the results on her tablet. Lyra watched her face carefully, looking for any indication of what might be causing her symptoms. What she saw instead was something unprecedented in her experience with Ethelgardian medical staff: surprise. The practitioner's neutral expression faltered, her eyes widening slightly as she looked from the tablet to Lyra and back again. "Is there a problem?" Lyra asked, anxiety rising. "The results are unexpected," the practitioner said, her voice maintaining its professional modulation despite the visible shock in her eyes. "I need to consult with Senior Medical Supervisor Theron. Please remain here." She left swiftly, the door sliding closed behind her with a soft hiss. Lyra sat up, heart pounding. What could possibly have surprised an Ethelgardian medical practitioner? They were trained to maintain neutrality in the face of the most serious diagnoses. Unless... No, she pushed the thought away. It wasn't possible. Cale was wrong. The medical council couldn't be wrong. The door opened again, admitting not only the original practitioner, but also a tall, austere man whose silver-edged uniform marked him as a high-ranking medical officer. His thin face bore the enhanced symmetry of the highest genetic lines, and his pale eyes moved over Lyra with clinical assessment. "I am Senior Medical Supervisor Theron," he announced unnecessarily. "Your diagnostic scan has produced anomalous results." "What kind of results?" Lyra asked, fighting to keep her voice steady. Theron tilted his head slightly, studying her as though she were a particularly interesting specimen. "According to our scans, you are approximately 8 weeks pregnant." The words hit Lyra like a physical blow. She heard them, understood them individually, but couldn't seem to process them together into meaning. "That's not possible," she said automatically. "The medical council certified that I am reproductively incompatible." "With Ethelgardian genetic protocols, yes," Theron agreed, his tone suggesting that this was still absolutely true. "However, it appears that natural conception has occurred." His gaze became more penetrating. "With a non-Ethelgardian partner, I presume?" The question was technically within medical purview, but felt invasive nonetheless. Lyra hesitated, reluctant to bring Cale into this situation, but knowing the concealment would only raise suspicions. "Yes," she admitted. "He's a contracted worker from the coastal settlements." Theron and the junior practitioner exchanged a glance that contained volumes of unspoken communication. Then the senior supervisor turned back to Lyra. "This is unprecedented in modern Ethelgard," he stated, his tone balanced between scientific interest and subtle disapproval. "Natural conception between genetic lines with such divergence hasn't been documented since before the optimization protocols were established." "But it's real?" Lyra asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm actually pregnant?" "The diagnostic scan is conclusive," Theron replied. "You are carrying a developing embryo." However, his tone sharpened slightly. "This raises significant medical and social considerations that must be addressed." Lyra's hand moved instinctively to her abdomen, a protective gesture she hadn't consciously intended. "What considerations?" "Your physical structure was deemed incompatible with Ethelgard's reproduction program for specific reasons," Theron explained with clinical detachment. "Your pelvic architecture and hormonal patterns deviate significantly from established safe parameters. This pregnancy represents unknown medical territory." "Meaning?" Lyra pressed, a new fear beginning to replace her shock. "Meaning that the Ethelgardian medical system cannot guarantee successful outcomes," Theron said bluntly. "Neither for you nor for the developing embryo." The junior practitioner stepped forward, her expression now carefully compassionate. "What Senior Supervisor Theron is explaining is that termination would be the medically advisable course of action. The unpredictability of your physiology combined with cross-genetic conception presents numerous risk factors." Termination. The word hung in the air between them, sterile and final. "I need to speak with my partner," Lyra said, finding strength in her voice that surprised her. Theron's eyebrows rose fractionally. "Of course. However, Given the unique circumstances, I am obligated to report this situation to the Social Integration Division. A pregnancy outside established protocols, particularly involving non-standard genetics, falls under their jurisdiction. Lyra felt cold dread spreading through her chest. The Social Integration Division was responsible for maintaining Ethelgard's carefully calibrated social harmony, determining where and how non-standard individuals could exist within the system without disrupting it. Their decisions were rarely favorable to those who deviated from norms. "I understand," she said, though she didn't. "Not fully. Not yet. You are free to leave," Theron said, stepping back. "However, I recommend you return within 3 days for follow-up assessment. Whatever decision is reached, proper medical monitoring is essential." The journey back to the waiting area seemed to take hours rather than seconds. When the door slid open and she saw Cale rising from his seat, his face tense with concern, Lyra felt something break inside her, a dam holding back emotions she hadn't allowed herself to feel. "Lyra," he asked, crossing to her immediately. "What is it? What do they say?" She couldn't speak, not here in the public waiting area where other Ethelgardians might overhear. She shook her head slightly and moved toward the exit. Cale followed without question, his hand coming to rest supportively at the small of her back. They walked in silence until they reached a small maintenance garden, one of the many green spaces scattered throughout the city for atmosphere balance rather than recreation. It was empty at this hour, offering a rare moment of privacy. "You were right," Lyra said as soon as they were alone, her voice unsteady. "I'm pregnant." Cale's expression transformed, joy breaking across his features like sunrise. But when he saw her face, the happiness faltered. "Lyra, isn't this good news?" "They say it's dangerous," she explained, the medical terminology suddenly insufficient to express her turmoil. "My body isn't. They don't think I can carry a child safely. They recommended termination." Cale's jaw tightened, a rare display of anger flickering in his eyes. "Based on what evidence? Has something like this happened before that they can reference?" "No, that's part of the problem. It's unprecedented in modern Ethelgard," she quoted bitterly. "They have no data, so they assume the worst. But humans reproduced naturally for thousands of years before Ethelgard's protocols," Cale argued, echoing his earlier point. "Bodies like yours, strong, healthy, were ideal for childbearing throughout most of human history." Lyra wanted desperately to believe him, but years of Ethelgardian conditioning were hard to overcome. What if they're right, though? What if there are complications? What if her voice caught on the fear she could barely articulate? What if something happens to the baby? Or to me? Cale's expression softened, and he reached out to take her hands in his. His touch was gentle but steady, an anchor in her storm of uncertainty. "I can't promise that nothing will go wrong," he said honestly. "No one can. But I believe in your body's wisdom more than I believe in their fear of difference. And whatever happens, whatever you decide, I will be with you. We'll face it together." His words reached something deep inside her, a part that had always longed for exactly this kind of acceptance and partnership. Not someone who saw her as flawless, but someone who saw her wholeness, her complexity, and chose to stand beside her nonetheless. "They're reporting this to the Social Integration Division," she told him, the practical concern asserting itself through her emotional turmoil. "This could affect both of us. Your work assignment, my housing." Cale's expression grew thoughtful. "Then we need to prepare. Consider our options before they make decisions for us." "What options do we have?" Lyra asked, the hopelessness she'd lived with for so long threatening to return. "More than they want us to believe," Cale said firmly. "The settlements would welcome you, welcome us, if Ethelgard becomes untenable. My family still is standing there. Or there are the independent territories to the north. Places where difference isn't just tolerated but valued." The idea of leaving Ethelgard, the only home she'd ever known, despite its coldness toward her, was both terrifying and strangely liberating. A world beyond these gleaming spires and perfect proportions. A place where her body might not be wrong. "I need time," she said finally, "to think, to decide." "We have time," Kale assured her, though both knew that might not be entirely true. Once the Social Integration Division became involved, timelines shortened considerably. They returned to Lyra's unit in subdued silence, each lost in their own thoughts. That night, as they lay together on her sleep mat, Kale's hand rested protectively over her still flat abdomen, and for the first time, Lyra allowed herself to imagine the impossible. A child of her own, a family created not through Ethelgard's clinical protocols, but through the most ancient and natural of means. The notification from a Social Integration Division arrived 2 days later, appearing on the communication panel of Lyra's living unit with the chime that indicated priority messaging. The message was brief, clinical, and absolute. She was to report to division headquarters the following morning for status assessment and protocol alignment. "They're not wasting any time," Kale observed grimly when she showed him the message that evening. "Someone at the medical facility must have flagged this as high priority." "What do you think they'll do?" Lyra asked, her hand unconsciously moving to her abdomen in what was becoming a habitual protective gesture. Kale's expression was carefully neutral, but she could see the tension in his shoulders. "Best case, they'll want to monitor the pregnancy closely, perhaps assign special housing, additional medical supervision. And worst case..." He hesitated, clearly reluctant to voice his darker thoughts. "Worst case, they could mandate termination on grounds of social stability or medical risk. Or they could revoke my work contract and housing assignment, separating us." The thought of being forced apart now, with this new life growing inside her, was unbearable. After years of isolation, Lyra had found connection, had found someone who saw her value rather than her deviation. And now, together, they had created something that Ethelgard had deemed impossible. "I won't let them take this from us," she said, surprised by the fierce determination in her own voice. Kale looked at her for a long moment, his dark eyes serious. "There are other options, Lyra. If we wait for their decision, we give them power over us. But if we act first..." "You mean leave," she said, understanding immediately. "Leave Ethelgard." He nodded slowly. "The contract laborers have transport to and from the settlements twice monthly. The next one leaves tomorrow evening. I could arrange passage for both of us. Just go. Leave everything." The idea was simultaneously terrifying and exhilarating. "Everything except what matters most," Kale said softly, his hand finding hers. "Each other. Our child. Our child." The words sent a shock of emotion through Lyra's chest. Until this moment, despite the medical confirmation, despite the fear and uncertainty, she hadn't fully embraced the reality of the life growing inside her. But hearing Kale say it, "our child," made it suddenly, overwhelmingly real. "What's it like?" she asked suddenly. "The settlements. What kind of life will we have there?" Kale's expression lightened, hope kindling in his eyes at her question. "Harder in some ways. More physical work. Fewer automated systems. But richer in others. Community. Acceptance of difference. Children. Playing freely, not sorted by genetic optimality." He described a world that seemed almost mythical to Lyra. Communal meals where people of all sizes and shapes gathered together, celebrations that honored diversity rather than conformity, work that was valued for its contribution rather than its alignment with predetermined protocols. "And would they accept me?" she asked, the fear underlying everything. "Someone so obviously formed by Ethelgard's genetics?" "They would welcome you," Kale said with absolute conviction. "Your strength would be valued, not hidden. Your height would be seen as an asset. And carrying a child," his voice softened, "that would be celebrated as the miracle it is, not treated as a problem to be managed." Lyra closed her eyes, trying to imagine this other life. It was difficult to envision a world so different from everything she'd known. But when she placed her hand over her abdomen, feeling the subtle changes happening within, she found her decision forming with surprising clarity. "If we go," she said, opening her eyes to meet Kale's gaze, "we need to be certain. There's no coming back." "I'm certain," Kale said without hesitation. "About you. About us. About the life we could build together." Lyra took a deep breath, feeling as though she stood on the edge of a precipice. Behind her lay everything familiar, however cold and unwelcoming. Before her, an unknown future, but one that offered the possibility of true belonging. "Then we go," she said, the words sending a surge of both terror and liberation through her body. Tomorrow. The practical preparations consumed the remainder of the evening. They packed sparingly. Ethelgard discouraged material accumulation, so neither had many possessions. Lyra included her small store of regenerative gel and the few personal items she'd accumulated over the years. Cale retrieved his tools and the small carved wooden figures he'd brought from the settlements, tangible connections to his homeland. They arranged to meet at the transport hub the following evening, after Lyra's scheduled assessment with the Social Integration Division. She would attend the meeting as normal to avoid raising alarms, then proceed directly to the hub, where Cale would be waiting with their passage secured. No matter what they say, no matter what they threaten, Cale reminded her, as they parted that morning, "Remember that we have another path." Lyra nodded, gathering her courage around her like armor. "I'll see you at the hub." Departure Section 4. The Social Integration Division headquarters rose like a monolith in the administrative sector of Ethelgard, a gleaming tower of silver and glass, its proportions meticulously calculated to inspire both awe and compliance. Lyra had been inside only once before, when she reached maturity and her anomalous physical development required assessment for appropriate social placement. She remembered the coldness of that experience, the clinical discussions of her limitations, the careful calculations of how her difference could be managed to minimize disruption to Ethelgard's harmony. She had left that day with her designation as a tolerated anomaly and her assignment to manual environmental maintenance, work that utilized her strength while keeping her mostly out of sight. Today, she entered with a new awareness of her own worth, a quiet defiance beneath her outwardly compliant demeanor. The automated system directed her to Assessment Room 17, where she found 3 division officials waiting, 2 women and 1 man, all with the perfect proportions and enhanced symmetry of high genetic lines. Anomaly 7729, the central figure, a woman with silver-streaked hair and piercing blue eyes, acknowledged her entry. "I'm Integration Supervisor Alara. These are my colleagues, Assessment Specialist Joran and Protocol Officer Naya. Please be seated." The chair provided was, predictably, too small for Lyra's frame. She perched awkwardly on its edge, refusing to hunch her shoulders or make herself smaller as she once would have. "We have received concerning information from the medical division regarding your current condition." Alara began without preamble. "Our scan confirms that you are carrying a developing embryo resulting from unsanctioned reproduction with a non-citizen contract laborer." The clinical description of her pregnancy, of her relationship with Cale, sent a surge of anger through Lyra's chest, but she kept her expression neutral. "Yes," she confirmed simply. "This situation presents significant complications from an integration perspective," Alara continued. "Unsanctioned reproduction outside established genetic protocols disrupts Ethelgard's carefully balanced social structure." "I understand that my pregnancy is unexpected," Lyra said carefully, "but I fail to see how it disrupts anything. My work in the Greenbelts is solitary. My living unit is in the outer ring, separate from standard citizens." "The issue is not your current status," Assessment Specialist Jorn interjected. "It is the introduction of an unauthorized genetic line into Ethelgard's population. A child of mixed heritage, particularly one carrying your anomalous physical traits combined with settlement genetics, would not align with established parameters. Fortunately," Protocol Officer Naya added with practiced composure, "there is a clear course of action that serves both social harmony and your own well-being. Medical Supervisor Theron has already recommended termination of the pregnancy on health grounds. We concur with this assessment and would add social integration factors as further justification." Their clinical discussion of ending her pregnancy, as if it were nothing more consequential than pruning an errant branch, cemented Lyra's resolve. These people saw her child as a disruption, an error to be corrected, just as they had always seen Lyra herself. And if I decline? She asked, her voice steadier than she'd expected. The three officials exchanged glances. It was clear they had anticipated compliance rather than resistance. That would be ill-advised, Alaris said finally. While Ethelgard respects bodily autonomy within established parameters, your situation falls outside those parameters. The Social Integration Division has authority to mandate medical intervention when necessary for community well-being. You would force me? Lyra asked, unable to keep the edge from her voice. We would prefer your cooperation, Joran said smoothly. However, if necessary, the division can implement Protocol 37, which temporarily suspends individual choice rights in cases of significant social disruption risk. Furthermore, Naya added, we would need to reassess your housing and work assignments. The outer ring units are not designed for multiple occupancy and certainly not for infant care. Your current anomalous status accommodation would need to be revoked. And the father? Lyra asked, though she already knew the answer. The contract labor's assignment would be terminated, Alaris stated without hesitation. His presence would no longer serve Ethelgard's interests given these developments. They would separate them, take Kale away, force her to end her pregnancy, and then, no doubt, place her under stricter supervision to prevent such disruptions in the future. Lyra nodded slowly, as if considering their words. I understand the division's position, she said carefully. This is a lot to process. May I have some time to consider? The officials seemed surprised by her reasonable tone, perhaps having expected emotional resistance. The medical procedures are most effective when performed promptly, Naya pointed out. Delay serves no practical purpose. 24 hours, Lyra countered, to prepare myself mentally, to say goodbye to possibilities. Alaris studied her for a long moment, then gave a slight nod. Very well. You will report to Medical Facility 7 tomorrow at midday for the procedure. Failure to appear will trigger automatic implementation of Protocol 37 and immediate status reassessment. Understand, Lyra said, rising to her full height. For once, she didn't try to diminish her stature, standing tall before the seated officials. Thank you for your consideration. She left the assessment room with measured steps, maintaining her composure until she had exited the building. Only then, in the relative privacy of a transit station, did she allow herself a moment of pure, burning anger. They saw her as nothing more than a problem to be managed, her child as an error to be erased, her love for Kale as an inconvenient attachment to be severed. But they had given her what she needed, time to escape, to choose a different future than the one they had planned for her. The remainder of the day passed in a haze of nervous anticipation. Lyra reported for her work shift as usual, tending to her section of the green belt with meticulous care. She found herself saying silent goodbyes to the trees she had nurtured for years, the plants that had been her only consistent companions before Kale. Would the settlement have forests? Gardens? Would she find green spaces there where she could feel at home? As her shift ended, she made her way to the transport hub with carefully controlled urgency. Her few possessions were packed in a single bag slung across her back, her identity chip still active, but soon to become meaningless once she left Ethelgard's boundaries. The hub was crowded with the evening transit users, Ethelgardians moving between sectors with their characteristic efficient purposefulness. Lyra made her way through them, acutely aware of her size, of the space she occupied, of the stare she still attracted despite years of exposure. Soon, she thought, I'll be somewhere where my body isn't wrong. The idea was still too new, too fragile to fully believe, but she clung to it. Nonetheless, Departure Section 4 was less crowded, reserved for non-citizen transport and supply shipments. Lyra spotted Kale immediately, standing near the departure gate with 2 travel packs at his feet. His face lit up when he saw her, relief evident in his expression. "You're here," he said as she reached him, his hand automatically finding hers. "How did it go with the integration division?" "Exactly as we expected," Lyra replied grimly. "They want to terminate the pregnancy, end your contract, and reevaluate my status." I have until tomorrow at midday before they implement what they call Protocol 37. Kale's jaw tightened, but he nodded. Then we're leaving just in time. I've secured our passage on the settlement transport. It leaves in 20 minutes. Lyra glanced around, suddenly aware of how exposed they were. Won't they track us? My chip will be deactivated once we're beyond Ethelgard's boundaries, Kale assured her. The settlements don't recognize their tracking systems, and we'll be traveling with other contract workers returning home. It's a regular transport, nothing suspicious. Still, tension coiled in Lyra's chest as they waited for boarding to begin. Every passing minute felt dangerous, every glance from hub security a potential threat. She had never broken a rule before, let alone contemplated leaving the only society she'd ever known. When the boarding announcement finally came, Lyra moved with deliberate casualness, following Kale toward the transport vehicle, a rugged, utilitarian craft that contrasted sharply with Ethelgard's sleek design aesthetics. About a dozen other workers were boarding, all with the same weathered appearance and practical clothing that marked them as outsiders in Ethelgard's refined environment. The transport officer, a bored-looking Ethelgardian with a data tablet, barely glanced at Kale's identification before waving him through. But when Lyra presented her chip, his expression sharpened with suspicion. "This is an Ethelgardian citizen chip," he observed, looking up at her with increased attention. "This transport is for returning contract workers only." Lyra felt her heart rate accelerate, but Kale stepped smoothly back to her side. "She has special clearance," he said with casual confidence. "Check the roster again. Anomaly status reassignment. The integration division processed it this morning." The officer frowned, consulting his tablet again with obvious skepticism. Lyra held her breath, wondering if their plan would fall apart before it even began. Then, unexpectedly, another voice joined the conversation. "She's with me." Lyra turned to see an older woman approaching, a settlement worker by her clothing, with silver-streaked dark hair and a face lined by sun and weather. Despite her age, she carried herself with unmistakable authority. "My apprentice," the woman continued, addressing the officer directly, "specially selected for the ecological restoration project. The paperwork was processed through division channels this morning." The officer looked between the older woman, Kale, and Lyra with lingering suspicion. "I don't see any such assignment on my manifest." The woman sighed with exaggerated patience. "Division bureaucracy, always inefficient with the outer sector assignments. I can contact Supervisor Marin directly if you'd prefer to delay the transport while we sort through their administrative errors." The mention of delay seemed to decide the matter for the officer. With a disgruntled nod, he waved them through. "For now, I'll update the manifest." Lyra followed Kale and the older woman into the transport, her heart pounding so loudly she was certain others must hear it. Only when they were seated and the doors had sealed did she dare to breathe normally again. "Thank you," Kale said quietly to the older woman, who had taken a seat across from them. "I didn't expect interference." The woman studied Lyra with keen dark eyes that reminded her suddenly of Kale's. "When my son told me he was bringing home an Ethelgardian woman, I assumed he was exaggerating about her remarkable qualities. I see now he wasn't." She extended a weathered hand. "I'm Shara, Kale's mother." Lyra took the offered hand, speechless with surprise. "You came to Ethelgard? For us." Shara's smile was wry. "For my son. For his chosen partner." And her gaze dropped briefly to Lyra's abdomen. "For my grandchild." Family travels to where it's needed in the settlements. The transport hummed to life, the slight vibration signaling imminent departure. Through the small window, Lyra watched as the gleaming structures of Ethelgard, the only home she'd ever known, however unwelcoming, began to recede. "They'll discover we're gone by tomorrow," she said softly to Kale, "when I don't report for the procedure. By then, we'll be beyond their jurisdiction," he assured her, his hand finding hers. "The settlements don't recognize Ethelgard's authority over individual choices. They can't force you back, and can't force you to return either," Shara added. Contract termination works both ways. They'll simply hire more workers from the outer territories. As the transport cleared the city's boundaries and accelerated toward the distant coastline, Lyra felt a strange mixture of fear and liberation. Behind her lay everything familiar: the rigid structures, the clear rules, the cold certainty of knowing exactly where she stood in the social hierarchy. Ahead lay the unknown, a new society with different values, different expectations, different definitions of worth. She placed her free hand over her abdomen, feeling the subtle changes that were already reshaping her body. Somewhere deep inside, a new life was growing, a life that Ethelgard had deemed impossible, then undesirable, but which Lyra now recognized as the most precious form of rebellion. "Welcome to the first day of your new life," Shera said, observing her with knowing eyes. "It won't always be easy, but I promise you this. In the settlements, your size will never again be seen as a flaw. Your strength will be honored, and your child will grow up knowing that difference is not deficiency." The journey to the coastal settlements took nearly 2 days, the transport moving at a steady pace through territories that became progressively less developed as they traveled westward. Lyra watched through the windows as Ethelgard's gleaming perfection gave way to the wilder landscapes beyond. Forests that grew without precise management, hills that rose and fell in natural patterns rather than design contours, settlements that sprawled organically rather than following geometric precision. It was beautiful in a way she had never considered before, chaotic, unpredictable, alive with variation. Kale and Shera pointed out landmarks as they traveled, telling stories of the regions they passed through. Lyra learned of the Great Division that had separated the technocratic societies like Ethelgard from the traditional communities that had chosen different paths of development. She heard of the coastal settlement's history as a haven for those who valued diversity, natural processes, and communal interdependence over technological optimization. "Our ancestors chose complexity over perfection," Shera explained. "They believed that standardization of bodies, of minds, of communities led to fragility. That true resilience comes from variation." When they finally arrived at the main settlement harbor, as sunset painted the sky in colors more vivid than Lyra had ever seen in Ethelgard's filtered environment, she found herself momentarily overwhelmed. The settlement was nothing like the sterile elegance she had known. It was a sprawling collection of structures built from natural materials, following the contours of the coastline, surrounded by gardens and small fields. And the people, they were so diverse. Tall, short, broad, thin, with skin in a spectrum of tones, moving with a variety of gaits and gestures. Children ran freely between buildings, their laughter carrying on the salt-tinged breeze. Elders sat in communal spaces, some with physical signs of aging that would have been corrected or hidden in Ethelgard. No one seemed concerned with uniformity. No one moved with the careful, identical precision of Ethelgardians. And most strikingly to Lyra, no one stared at her with surprise or disdain. Her height, her breadth, her obvious difference from Ethelgardian norms, none of it seemed remarkable here. "This is the council hall," Kale explained as they approached a large building with wide doors and a sloping roof. "New arrivals are welcomed here, given temporary housing until permanent arrangements can be made." Inside, the space was warm and wooden, with high ceilings that Lyra didn't need to duck beneath. A group of elders, the settlement council, Shera explained, greeted them with genuine interest rather than the practiced politeness of Ethelgardian officials. When Lyra explained her situation, her anomalous status in Ethelgard, her pregnancy, her escape from forced termination, there were no clinical assessments, no discussions of protocols or parameters. Instead, the elders' responses ranged from outrage at Ethelgard's treatment of her to practical offers of support. "Our midwives have experience with all manner of births," an elder woman assured her, her weathered face creasing with a warm smile. "Your size is an advantage, not a concern. Strong women bear strong children. Kale's family compound has room for both of you," another elder added. And the greenhouse project needs someone with knowledge of plant cultivation. Your skills from the green belts would be valuable there. Valuable. Lyra turned the word over in her mind. Not tolerated. Not managed. Valuable. That night, in a room provided for them in Kale's family compound, a spacious chamber with a bed actually sized for her frame, Lyra lay awake long. After Kale had fallen asleep, her mind struggled to process the dramatic changes of the past days, the complete reversal of everything she had known. Her hand rested on her abdomen, where the subtle roundness was becoming more pronounced each day. Within her, a life was growing that would never know the cold assessment of Ethelgard's medical council, never bear an anomaly designation, never learn to make itself smaller to avoid notice. Her child would be born in a place where difference was expected, where strengths were recognized regardless of their alignment with predetermined standards, where the measure of worth wasn't conformity but contribution. For the first time since she had learned of her pregnancy, Lyra allowed herself to fully embrace the possibility of motherhood, not as a biological impossibility or a social disruption, but as the most natural expression of her body's capabilities. Here, in this place where her size was strength rather than deviation, perhaps she could finally inhabit her body completely, without shame or hesitation. The following months unfolded with a rhythm entirely different from the regimented precision of Ethelgard. Lyra found work in the settlement's expansive greenhouses, where her knowledge of plant cultivation was indeed valued. Her height and strength, rather than being sources of awkwardness, made her particularly effective at tasks that others found challenging. The settlement's midwives monitored her pregnancy with a combination of traditional wisdom and modified medical technology. Where Ethelgard's practitioners had seen only risk and deviation, these women saw health and natural adaptation. Your pelvis is perfectly designed for childbearing, the senior midwife assured her during an examination. Broad and strong, and your body is producing all the right hormones in all the right patterns. Whoever told you otherwise was measuring against an artificial standard, not biological reality. As her body changed with the advancing pregnancy, Lyra experienced a profound shift in her relationship to her physical self. In Ethelgard, she had always felt wrong, too large, too strong, too much. Here, draped in the loose, natural fabrics favored by settlement women, her growing belly a testament to creation rather than deviation, she began to feel right in a way she never had before. Kale watched this transformation with quiet joy. "You stand differently now," he observed one evening as they walked along the shoreline after the day's work. Straighter, prouder. Lyra realized he was right. The habitual hunch of her shoulders, the automatic minimizing of her presence, these had gradually disappeared over the months in the settlement. "I don't feel wrong anymore," she tried to explain, searching for words to express the profound change. "In Ethelgard, I was always trying to be less tall, less visible, less myself. Here, I can just be." Kale's hand found hers, his fingers interlacing with her larger ones in a familiar pattern they had established. "You were never wrong," he said with the simple certainty that was so fundamentally part of him. "But I'm glad you can finally see what I've always seen." The child grew strong within her, active and vigorous according to the midwife's assessments. By the 7th month, Lyra's body had transformed dramatically, her always powerful frame now curved with the unmistakable fullness of advanced pregnancy. In Ethelgard, she would have been a spectacle, an anomaly compounded. In the settlement, she received only approving nods from elders, offers of traditional strengthening teas. Occasional hands reached out to feel the baby's movements when she gave permission. It was during the 8th month that news arrived from Ethelgard, carried by returning contract workers who still traveled between the communities. The Social Integration Division had officially designated Lyra as non-compliant status and revoked her citizenship. Her disappearance had apparently caused sufficient disruption to warrant formal documentation, a sign, Sharon noted wryly, that Ethelgard considered her more significant than they had ever acknowledged while she was there. "Does it bother you?" Kale asked as they discussed the news that evening. Losing your citizenship. Lyra considered the question seriously. It should, she admitted. It's all I ever had there. The only form of belonging they offered, limited as it was. She looked around the warm, wooden room of their home in the compound, at the crib Cale had crafted from driftwood, at the community beyond their windows where her difference had become merely one variation among many. But I found something better than citizenship. I found home. 2 weeks later, as the first winter storms rolled in from the ocean, Lyra went into labor. Despite the medical warnings she had received in Ethelgard, her body seemed to know exactly what to do. The midwives provided guidance and support, but remarked repeatedly on the efficiency of her strong muscles, the perfect positioning of the baby, the textbook progression of her labor. Your body was made for this, the senior midwife told her during a particularly challenging contraction. Trust it. It knows the way. Cale remained at her side throughout, his steady presence an anchor as she worked through the pain and effort of bringing their child into the world. When dawn broke after a full night of labor, their daughter was born, a robust, healthy girl with Lyra's strong frame and Cale's dark eyes. They named her Thera, a settlement name meaning new beginning. She weighed more than the average settlement newborn, but no one remarked on this as a concern, only as a sign of health and vigor. Her lungs were strong, her grip powerful as she clutched her father's finger with surprising determination for one so new to the world. She's perfect, Cale whispered as they cradled her between them, the midwives having departed to give a new family their first moments of privacy together. Lyra gazed down at their daughter, marveling at the tiny fingers, the rosebud mouth, the dark wisps of hair that already promised to be thick and strong. She agreed, her voice thick with emotion. And she's free to grow into whoever she's meant to be. In that moment, exhausted but triumphant, Lyra felt a completion she had never imagined possible during her lonely years in Ethelgard. Her body, once deemed too large, too different, too flawed to reproduce, had created and nurtured this perfect life. The very aspects of her physiology that Ethelgard had labeled as deviations had proven to be strengths in the most fundamental act of creation. The news of Thera's birth spread quickly through the settlement. In the days that followed, a steady stream of visitors arrived bearing gifts, food, and offers of support. It was a custom, Shara explained, to surround new mothers with community care during the first weeks, sharing the responsibilities of meals, household tasks, and emotional support to allow the new family to bond and recover. In Ethelgard, Lyra observed one afternoon as she nursed Thera while another settlement woman prepared dinner in their kitchen. New mothers are isolated in medical recovery units. The babies are kept in specialized nurseries, brought to the mothers only at scheduled feeding times. The settlement woman looked up from her cooking, her expression one of genuine bewilderment. But how do they learn their babies? How do they discover all the little noises and movements that tell you what your child needs? Lyra had no answer. The clinical efficiency of Ethelgard's reproductive protocols suddenly seemed not merely cold, but fundamentally misguided, optimized for measurable outcomes rather than the complex, intuitive dance of mother and child learning each other. As the weeks passed, Lyra's body recovered its strength with remarkable speed. The midwives attributed this to her natural vigor, the support of the community, and the practice of mother-warming, a settlement tradition of specially prepared foods and herbal infusions designed to restore balance after birth. By the time Thera was 3 months old, Lyra had resumed limited work in the greenhouses, wearing her daughter in a sling across her chest as she tended the plants. Her height and strength, combined with the natural adaptation of her body to motherhood, made this arrangement entirely practical. Thera thrived in the warm, humid environment, surrounded by green growth and the gentle voices of the other workers who delighted in the baby's presence. It was during this period that a new transport arrived from Ethelgard, one of the regular shipments of supplies and returning contract workers. But this transport carried an unexpected passenger. Lyra was in the central marketplace when the news reached her. A medical officer from Ethelgard had arrived, specifically requesting to speak with her. Her first instinct was fear. Had they come to enforce the Integration Division's protocols even beyond Ethelgard's boundaries? Had her non-compliant status triggered some form of retrieval attempt? Kale found her quickly, alerted by friends who had seen the arrival. "Don't worry," he assured her, his hand steady on her shoulder. "The settlements don't recognize Ethelgard's authority here. They cannot force you to do anything." Together, with Thera secure in her sling, they made their way to the council hall where the visitor was waiting. To Lyra's surprise, it was not an Integration Division officer, but the junior medical practitioner who had been present during her pregnancy diagnosis. The thin woman whose expression had shown that flicker of compassion beneath professional detachment. The practitioner rose as they entered, her eyes widening slightly as she took in the sight of Lyra with her child. In the stark, simple clothing of the settlements rather than an Ethelgard uniform, the practitioner seemed smaller, less imposing, almost vulnerable. "You're well," she said. It wasn't quite a question. Her gaze moved to Thera, visible in the sling. "And the child?" "She's healthy." "Perfectly," Lyra confirmed, a protective hand moving to rest against her daughter's back. "Why are you here? What does Ethelgard want with us now?" The practitioner's carefully neutral expression faltered slightly. "I'm not here in an official capacity," she admitted. "I left my position in the medical division. I'm seeking—" She hesitated, as if the words were unfamiliar. "Asylum. In the settlements." It was the last thing Lyra had expected. Asylum? Why? The practitioner, Mira, she introduced herself, without the usual Ethelgardian identifier codes, explained haltingly that Lyra's case had triggered something in her. A doubt. A question about the absolute correctness of Ethelgard's biological parameters. "After you left, I began reviewing historical medical data, pre-optimization records," Mira explained. "Women of your physical type were not merely capable of successful reproduction. They often had the most favorable outcomes, particularly in environments with limited medical intervention." She had taken her findings to Senior Medical Supervisor Theron, suggesting a re-examination of the classification protocols for physical variants. His response had been swift and final. Mira was suspended from her duties pending cognitive realignment therapy. "I realized then that Ethelgard's commitment was not to biological truth, but to a predetermined definition of optimal," Mira said, her voice gaining strength as she spoke. "When the evidence contradicted the established parameters, the evidence was suppressed, not incorporated. Rather than submit to realignment, she had requested transfer to an outer sector medical facility, then used that position to secure passage on a transport to the settlements. I want to learn different approaches to medicine," she explained, looking from Lyra to Kale with an intensity that belied her still formal demeanor. "Approaches that recognize and work with natural variation rather than attempting to standardize all bodies and processes." Lyra found herself speechless, struggling to reconcile this earnest seeker with the clinical practitioner who had stood by, while Senior Supervisor Theron recommended terminating her pregnancy. It was Kale who responded first. "The settlements welcome those who seek new knowledge," he said carefully. "But learning here requires openness to ways of knowing beyond data and measurement. Our medicine combines observation and evidence with tradition and intuition." Mira nodded, a hint of the old Ethelgardian certainty in her posture. "I understand. I'm prepared to learn from the beginning if necessary." Later, after the council had assigned Mira temporary housing and arranged for her to apprentice with one of the settlement's medical practitioners, Lyra and Kale discussed the unexpected arrival as they walked along the shore, Thera sleeping peacefully against her mother's chest. "Do you believe her?" Lyra asked, still unsettled by the encounter. "That she came because of me, because of us?" Kale considered the question with his usual thoughtfulness. "I believe she experienced a genuine disruption to her worldview," he said finally. "Whether she's truly ready to embrace a different perspective, that remains to be seen. It's strange to think that our leaving might have changed anything in Ethelgard," Lyra mused. "We were just trying to save ourselves, to protect our child. Sometimes the most powerful acts of resistance are simply living truthfully," Kale replied, his hand finding hers as they walked. "By thriving here, By proving that the impossible was not only possible, but natural, you've created a crack in their certainty. And cracks can spread. As the seasons changed and Thera grew from infant to toddler, more visitors arrived from Ethelgard. Not officials seeking to enforce protocols, but individuals drawn by whispered stories of the anomalous woman who had defied medical predictions and borne a healthy child beyond the city's boundaries. Some came briefly, curious but ultimately unwilling to abandon the security and familiarity of Ethelgard. Others, like Mira, stayed, people who had never quite fit the precise parameters of their birth society, who had longed for a place where difference was neither hidden nor merely tolerated, but accepted as part of the natural spectrum of humanity. Thera thrived in this environment of diversity and acceptance. By her second birthday, she showed signs of inheriting her mother's height and strength combined with her father's quick mind and steady temperament. She moved with the unself-conscious confidence of a child who had never been made to feel wrong or different, who had been surrounded from birth by a community that celebrated variation rather than enforcing conformity. On a warm summer evening, as Thera played nearby under Shara's watchful eye, Lyra and Kale sat together on the porch of their home in the family compound, watching the sun sink toward the western horizon. 4 years had passed since their escape from Ethelgard. 4 years of building a new life in a community that had welcomed them with genuine openness. Do you ever miss it? Kale asked suddenly. Ethelgard. The order of it. The certainty. Lyra considered the question seriously, as was her way. Sometimes I miss specific things, she admitted. The quiet of the green belts at dawn. The way the light filtered through the engineered trees. The clarity of knowing exactly what was expected, even if I could never quite meet those expectations. She looked out at the settlement spreading before them. The organic arrangement of homes and communal buildings, the gardens and workshops where people of all shapes and sizes moved according to their own rhythms rather than synchronized efficiency. At the edge of their view, she could see the new medical center where Mira now worked alongside traditional healers, combining Ethelgardian precision with settlement wisdom in an approach that valued results over protocols. But I don't miss feeling wrong, she continued. I don't miss making myself smaller. And I can't imagine Thera growing up there, learning to doubt herself, to see her body as a deviation rather than a gift. As if hearing her name, Thera looked up from her play and ran toward them, her movements powerful and graceful, her smile wide and uninhibited. At 3 years old, she was already taller than most settlement children her age, her frame promising to echo her mother's impressive stature. But unlike Lyra's childhood in Ethelgard, Thera's height was noted only as one more interesting variation in a community that valued diversity. "Mama," she called, launching herself into Lyra's waiting arms with complete confidence that she would be caught and held secure. "I found a shell that looks like the moon." Lyra gathered her daughter close, marveling as always at the miracle of her existence. This life that Ethelgard had deemed impossible, then undesirable, now thriving in the freedom of the settlements. She caught Kale's gaze over their daughter's head and saw in his eyes the same wonder, the same fierce protectiveness, the same deep joy. "No," she said, answering his earlier question with newfound certainty. "I don't miss Ethelgard at all. Everything I need is right here." In the years that followed, the steady trickle of arrivals from Ethelgard gradually increased. Individuals, and occasionally small families seeking a different way of living, drawn by stories of the settlement's acceptance of diversity. Each arrival brought news of the city they had left behind. Ethelgard was changing, albeit slowly. The rigid parameters that had defined optimal human development for generations were being quietly expanded. New research divisions were exploring the benefits of controlled genetic diversity rather than standardized conformity. The Social Integration Division had revised some of its more restrictive protocols regarding physical variance. Whether these changes were directly influenced by Lyra's case was impossible to know. Perhaps her defiance had indeed created cracks in Ethelgard's certainty. Perhaps Myra's research before her departure had planted seeds of doubt in the medical division. Or perhaps it was simply the inevitable evolution of a society too rigidly defined to adapt to a changing world. What mattered more to Lyra was the life she had built beyond Ethelgard's boundaries. As Thera grew into a tall, strong girl with her father's thoughtful nature and her mother's quiet determination, Lyra found herself expanding in ways that had nothing to do with physical size. She developed new skills in the settlement's agricultural projects, eventually taking leadership of the greenhouse initiatives that supplied food and medicine to the community. Her knowledge of plant cultivation, combined with her natural strength and height, made her invaluable in this role. Kale System's expertise similarly found new applications in the settlements, where he worked to integrate appropriate technologies with traditional practices, creating hybrid solutions that respected both innovation and heritage. Together, they built a life of purpose and connection that would have been unimaginable within Ethelgard's rigid structures. When Thera was 7, Lyra gave birth to their second child, a son they named Aaron, another settlement name meaning strength from the earth. His arrival was attended by a team that included Mira, now fully integrated into the settlement's medical community, who documented the birth as part of an ongoing study of diverse maternal physiologies. Like his sister, Aaron was born healthy and strong. Like his sister, he would grow up in a community that valued his unique combination of traits rather than measuring him against predetermined standards of optimal development. And like his sister, he would know the story of how his mother's body, once deemed too large to reproduce, had created life not once but twice, defying the limitations others had tried to impose upon it. On Aaron's naming day, as the community gathered to welcome the newest member of their family, an elder asked Lyra if she would share her story for the traditional recording, the oral histories that the settlement maintained alongside their written records. She agreed, understanding the importance of such stories in shaping community values and preserving knowledge across generations. As the sun set and the naming day celebration continued around them, Lyra sat with the elder and carefully recounted her journey, from the isolation of being too much in Ethelgard to the fullness of being exactly enough in the settlements. She spoke of the medical council's certainty and the social integration division's protocols. She described the fear and liberation of leaving everything familiar to seek a place where difference was not merely tolerated but valued. And she explained how Kale, the only human who had truly seen her, had made her a mother not once but twice, proving that her body's wisdom exceeded Ethelgard's rigid parameters. Your children will grow in a world that sees their mother's strength as a gift, the elder said when Lyra had finished her story. And that is how healing happens, not in a single generation, but in the stories we tell and the truths we honor. As darkness fell and the celebration fires burned lower, Lyra found a moment of quiet with her family. Kale beside her, Thera leaning against her side, baby Aaron sleeping peacefully in her arms. Looking at them, she felt a completeness that transcended all the limitations others had tried to place upon her body and her life. In Ethelgard, she had been an anomaly, a deviation, a body too big to fulfill its biological purpose according to their narrow definitions. But here, in this community that recognized the wisdom and value of difference, she was simply Lyra, strong, capable, and perfectly designed for the life she was meant to live. A mother, a partner, a valued member of her community. Whole, not despite her difference, but because of it. And that, she realized as she held her sleeping son and felt her daughter's warm weight against her side, was the most profound form of belonging she could imagine. Not fitting into predetermined parameters, but being recognized and valued for exactly who and what she was in all her magnificent, powerful uniqueness. Her body had never been too big to reproduce. It had simply been waiting for the right place, the right person, and the right understanding of what it meant to be perfectly, gloriously human.